Very excited to welcome back to the program senior reporter for The Root and the host and founder of the Black Diplomats podcast, Terrell Starr. Welcome back to the Damage Report.
Hey, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Y'all are my favorite guys. So
thank you so much. Glad to have you here. And you're here via Ukraine, actually. That's where you're located right now.
Yes, I'm in the Western Carpathian Mountains. A night train over from Kiev, the capital, further in the east or central part of the area. Yeah, in the cabin, as a matter of fact.
Well, you might well be our first guest who's Skyping in from Ukraine, probably a gap that we should have filled a while ago. But we want to talk about a number of different things. Obviously, Ukraine's going to be a part of it. But let's start off with the podcast, the Black Diplomats podcast. What was the sort of the mission behind it?
So Black Diplomats podcast is really about bringing in non-white voices to have conversations about foreign policy, but also decolonizing the conversation when it comes to foreign affairs. And so we look at the foreign affairs model one from an imperial complex, right? One that puts America at the top and everyone else at the bottom, or the bottom people looking to America as a moral foundation. But as you all know, with the Young Turks and the work that you all do, you know America is full. And so what I do from a foreign policy perspective is explain why America is full. And so a lot of publications that aim at publications or podcasts that talk about foreign policy, they center American thinking, they center Western ideals, but they center, again, an imperialist construct, right? One that's and a capitalist construct when you think about the military-industrial complex. My challenge with Black diplomats is to say that Black people are disproportionately harmed by all these complexes, not only Black people, but other people of color. And ultimately, when we really think about it, white people are being screwed over by this military-industrial complex. We just need a platform where we're bold enough to say so. And so Black Diplomats, for going on our 6th episode, is really about bringing all these voices together, centering Black people, centering people of color, so that we can really create a safe space, a space where you don't feel like you have to fit this conventional definition of an expert in order to talk about the world.
Yeah. And look, the U.S. media has been long criticized, and rightfully so, for not having much coverage of what goes on outside of our borders. But even when they do, it tends to be academics, overwhelmingly white, very rarely people who are actually affected by the events or the policies that they're talking about. And you're not just talking to people who can analyze it. You're talking to people who are affected by what America does domestically and abroad.
Absolutely. And that's the whole point. So the reason why I named my podcast Black Diplomats is that anybody can be a diplomat. You don't have to be in the foreign service. You don't have to be a part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs if we're talking about Europe or any other part of the world. You just have to be somebody that is curious about where you live and having a conversation with somebody across borders. That's what being a diplomat is, picking up the torch, being willing to say that this is what's going on in my community. Tell me about what's going on in your community so we can have conversations. And what often happens, and I've learned this from my job as a senior reporter at The Root, traveling around the country, you really don't get an understanding about how people look at America until you get on a plane, you go down to Mississippi, you go down to the Delta, you go down to Middle America, you go to Detroit, you go to Baltimore, you leave this social media network where you have kind of like all the intellectual thought, which is important, right? I mean, that adds value. That leads to discourse in many respects. But if you want to understand the electorate, it's about getting your feet on the ground and talking to the people. And that's what Black Diplomats does. But the only difference is that we're doing it on a global scale. And so we're getting the feet of the people are on the podcast. And so I purposefully center people who are activists who are doing the work. One of my episodes, the 2nd episode, dealt with a Black woman, an Ethiopian woman who organizes domestic workers in Lebanon, because a lot of Ethiopians go to Lebanon for domestic work. And in Lebanon, they have something like a modern day slavery system for people who go there. And so Lebanon is going through a currency crisis. And so where do we hear about these stories where somebody can go on for an hour and talk about these things? And so Black Diplomats is that destination. And so absolutely, it's all about the people. And as we proceed, We're going to have more conversations with the people. One of our episodes is going to deal with LGBTQ plus people in Eastern Europe. What is it like to be an activist? What is it like to do the work, be on the ground, and advocate for your rights if you're a gay person or if you're a trans person in Russia, in Georgia? And so that's the thing about Russia. When you hear about Russia, we're going to hear about queer voices, gay voices, the unconventional voices that we rarely hear about, as opposed to the people at the think tanks.
Yeah. No, look, that's fascinating. And I'm already looking forward to, hopefully us talking again in the future and talking about more of your episodes, because the two examples you just cited, I mean, maybe at some point something was talked about on CNN, but I can't remember. And if it was probably someone in the US who had traveled there rather than someone on the ground who's actually working on it. You did mention, though, getting that perspective of America and its policies from people who aren't inherently biased by living here. And so you're in Ukraine right now, and I'm curious. I've been wondering, as 2020 has developed and America has failed to address the pandemic worse than perhaps any country in the world, and its reaction to the civil rights protests have been incredibly barbaric and cruel. How are people outside of the U.S. seeing that?
That's an excellent question. So a lot of people now, the wool has been removed from people's eyes in many respects. People see America for what it truly is. And in my personal experience, I'm unique in that I am a Black American that a lot of Ukrainians don't really have any access to or exposure to. In fact, my guest here, my host, who's hosting me at this property, I'm the first American that she's dealt with. And so American, period, right? Now, mind you, I'm in the mountains of Western Ukraine. And so, there's a lot of curiosity about Trump. There's a lot of curiosity about protests and everything. And so I think that there's really a question about, wow, I thought America was a civil society. I thought America, these types of things don't happen. And so I think a lot of us live under the assumption that people think that they know, that people think that folks know what's going on in America. But in reality, they really have very little idea. They see things in the media, but they don't know who to trust or what to trust or which sources are telling them the truth, because they've been bought into this idea of American exceptionalism, right? Even though in their hearts they know it's not true. One thing that complicates that is that the Americans that they do have contact with are often white, and they don't have the personal experiences, unless they're vigilant about it, to tell them that the America that they've grown up to understand is not what it is. And so I spend a great deal of my time in my own kind of personal diplomacy, giving them the real, much more a clearer story about all of the troubles and all of the racism and all the white supremacy and the imperialism that America undertakes in order to assume its power. And those conversations often are very illuminating for people here.
Yeah. You say that they're not sure what news they should trust. And like when I'm combing through the news every day to put together my show, I don't always know necessarily. And I live here, so I can only imagine how much more difficult it is when you're stripped of the context of growing up around some of these outlets.
Yeah, but listen, though, when you think about news and information, my job and your job is to disseminate information. We're trained to do this. Okay, so we're media junkies. We're on social media. We know the responsibility of looking at a story, giving you the facts as they are, and we know if there's something that's bogus or something that's questionable. We know how to do that. Most people are not trained in media literacy. And one of the reasons why is that if you really think about it, I don't know how old you are, I'm 40 years old. And so I remember the times back in the early 2000s where you only had the outlets of the major three, the CBS, ABC, CNN, you name it, and NBC, right? Those outlets. And you had the advent of Fox News eventually that came on later, but you had these 4 or 5 entities that, from a broadcast standpoint, then you had the New York Times and the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, et cetera. There you had they had something like a monopoly on news dissemination. And so you had these few outlets where you could see, okay, if news got out, it likely came from these places. Now you have social media where somebody could come on and they themselves can become a source of news. I know even as an independent journalist, I function that way. you function that way. However, we both are trained as journalists, right? And so it's not, but just imagine the people, there are so many people online who have a personality and have a code of personality. And because of that alone, they're considered news sources. Okay. Yeah. And so, and the thing is that the way that our Constitution works, being able to disseminate news is not dependent on where you work. It's a freedom of speech. And if people believe your speech, you can build a platform off of it. That's what people don't understand about the dissemination of information. Unlike doctors, unlike lawyers, unlike other professions, there's no license to be a journalist. It's about where you work.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.